I'd like to welcome everyone back to our latest April IMAP monthly lunch seminar. And I don't want to take too much more time before we dive into it. And I'd just like to, without much further ado, introduce one of our senior fellows, Dr. Private. Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay. So 2 questions. Did we ever really get this IT stuff sorted out? And second is, when does global warming start? Okay. Good day. I'm Heinberg. Title of the talk is Common Environmental Scoring of Fossil Fuels for Foreign Trade and Investment Decisions. I am, I think, the most junior member of the impact measurement and allocation program, but it's the time trying to figure out what does impact measurement and allocation mean. And part of this is going to be the framework of this talk is going to be sort of a meditation on that. So with apologies to people that really know about this program, I have made for myself a simplified scheme of impact measurement and allocation. This is kind of what I imagine it to be. Very much subject to revision, refinement, and correction. I'm not going to go through every box on this chart, but I will say, just in terms of background, that I'm a physicist, so I'm very interested in numbers and measurements. And so we're going to be looking at this chart through a kind of a very small soda straw, sort of at a few boxes, which have a lot of concern for numbers and measurements. So let's sort of dive in. Okay, so lots of numbers and measurements on the top line. So in order to have data to put into your impact measurement and evaluation scheme, there's sort of 2 ways of getting data. One is to make estimates, and that is a good method when it's easy to estimate things in your system. The other, if it's not easy to estimate things, then you should really make measurements. So that's what's in the red box at the top. Either you make estimates or you make measurements. So let's just see how that works in the context of what I'm interested in, which is fossil fuels and greenhouse gases coming from fossil fuels. Okay. So you all know carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas. The United States produces 6.3 billion metric tons of it per year. Now, the total global is about, these days, about 40 billion metric tons. The US is responsible for about 1/6. What I've done, and this is a chart from the Environmental Protection Agency, what I've done is divided the pie chart into 2 big pieces. The first piece, which is about 45%, is electricity and industry. So this comprises a countable number of large sources. The EPA collects, by law, collects data called the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So all the owners of electric power plants and large industries have to submit reports to EPA every year telling them how much carbon dioxide they emit. And this is for all sources greater than 25,000 tons a year. Now, 25,000 tons sounds like a lot, but actually it's not, fortunately. The other part of the pie chart, the 55%, is a large number of small sources. So the transportation sector, we have millions, tens of millions of automobiles. On the residential and commercial side, you have tens of millions of buildings, actually hundreds of millions of buildings. And there, you can't possibly tabulate them one at a time as you do for the large sources. So people use sort of statistical estimation. So I'm going to give you an example of each of those data inputs. Okay, so let's look at the large power plant. As an example, I've taken my very hometown, I think it's my only hometown, electric power plant, the Kendall cogeneration station. You see it when you drive into Cambridge across the Longfellow Bridge. Actually, to tell you the truth, I thought this thing was shut down. It is not. It is not, it just does, there's nothing visible about it that's doing anything. But it does have the capacity to generate 235 megawatts nameplate power. In reality, it's running more or less about half the time, 130 megawatts annual average power output. This is a rapidly responding dual fuel moderate efficiency power plant, so it's used for peaking. So in other words, when the power demand goes up, this thing turns on. The sort of core of it is something that looks like and probably is a General Electric jet engine. That's mostly run on natural gas, but it can also run on fuel oil. So here on the lower left is basically a summary of what this plant submits to the EPA as part of the greenhouse gas reporting program. And this is for 2022. This is the main unit plant. So that year they burned 11 trillion British thermal units, or 11,700 billion British thermal units of natural gas, a much smaller quantity of fuel oil. Then the EPA gives sort of default emission factors. So this tells you how much carbon dioxide is generated per unit of energy. The plant itself seems to have provided its own correction factors, so that's okay. Bottom line, this plant, which I thought wasn't doing anything, although I see it many times a year, emitted 650,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So this little nothing plant, Cambridge, yeah, better part of 1 million tons. So that is a typical large facility. So, and these data are very, very good. I mean, this is right probably to a couple of percent. Okay, here's the other way of doing it. This is sort of the estimation way for myriads of small sources. I'm taking, for example, the transportation sector. What happens here is that the Energy Information Administration, a different agency, totals up all the petroleum products that are used in transportation. So look at these columns. There's a column labeled jet fuel. There's a column labeled motor gasoline. The residual fuel oil is mostly marine fuel. So they know how much gas is being, or how much fuel is being sold in the United States of each type. They figure out the US fleet average for the use of these fuels, fleet average of automobiles. They count every automobile as the average. And then again, multiplied by emission factors. In the end, they come up with what turns out to be 1.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide in the whole transportation system. Now, there's another greenhouse gas, the second most important greenhouse gas is methane. And it's been in the news a lot. Hopefully you've read about it in the newspaper. But unlike carbon dioxide, which is really pretty easy to estimate, you can estimate to within a few percent. Methane emission inventory is really, really hard. The problem is that there are so many potential sources. Now there's 271 coal burning power plants in the United States, 271. There's maybe a few thousand natural gas burning power plants, but there's 1 million wells producing oil and gas in the United States alone. 400,000 miles of gathering pipeline, 5,000 gathering compressor stations, 700 gas processing plants, and then there's the transmission sector and the distribution sector, which is even more scary, especially here in Boston. Any of these things can be emitting methane because methane is not part of the process. Methane emission is not part of the process of getting anything useful. When you burn gasoline, you get to go in car drives. But methane is either leaks, which are completely unintentional, or vents, which are unscheduled and basically safety measures. Like for instance, you don't want your tank to explode, so you have a pressure release valve, but you don't know how much methane you could exhausted into the atmosphere to lower the pressure. I mean, you could figure that out, but nobody does figure it out because there's no economic interest in measuring it. So, and then you've got these millions of sources. You know, if you have a leak in a flange, you're gonna have methane coming out of it. How big is the leak? You have no idea. You have no idea that it's even there in all this hardware. So methane, really hard. Okay, here's an example of how awful it is to try and figure out how much methane you're putting into the atmosphere from anthropogenic sources. This is me. I'm implementing method 21, EPA method 21. Looking for, you know, checking every valve, every flange, every pump in this engineering test facility in San Antonio, middle of the summer, of course, that's when I just got sent on these trips. I'll tell you, this is extremely frustrating because 5 mile per hour wind blows it away. So again, really hard to get methane in. If your bolts are not tightened enough on your flange, you've got fugitive methane. Now, is that going to let out 10 grams an hour, a kilogram an hour, a ton an hour? All those outcomes are possible depending on how tight the bolts are. Do you see the problem? I am not going to compare methane to CO2 because they have such different properties in the atmosphere. First of all, the radiative forcing from methane is much greater, but it only lasts for a few decades in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, less radiative forcing, but lasts for centuries. And yes, people use this global warming potential to try to put them on a common scale. I've just written a paper basically saying that anybody uses that should not be published. They should be rejected. And I'm serious about that, and that's another time. Okay, so again, looking at the problems of measuring methane leakage, this is an example. This was a more or less semi-continuous, quasi-continuous measurement of methane emissions from an underground gas storage facility over a period of a year on the horizontal axis. Vertical axis is estimated methane emission rate in kilograms an hour. But look at the scale, if you see it, it's a logarithmic scale. So the measured emissions from this one facility ranged from about 1 kilogram an hour to about 700 kilograms an hour. And with no idea, you know, totally unpredictable when those things are going to come out. And, you know, varying all over the place. So, and this was done in 2 ways: a ground-based measurement and aircraft measurement, which surprisingly overlapped, given the large range of emissions. So you have intermittent and highly variable emission rates.
And it's not tied to weather or seasonality or something like that?
Actually, there are time of day effects. There are all kinds of subtle things going on. But in general, it's kind of unpredictable.
Okay.
And then finally, these big emission events can be of variable duration. So it's important to know how, if you're going to know how much methane is getting into the atmosphere, you have to know how long it's emitting at 1 ton an hour, how many hours. So this this study, which was submitted to the EPA, and again, the count number is on a logarithm scale. So the durations run from 10 minutes to 500 minutes, and believe me, it also can run for days, weeks, and months. So again, duration, no idea. Typically, you're measuring a site a few times a year at best, and sort of a quick view. So you're there for a few minutes. You're getting a estimate of size and so on. You have no idea how long it lasts. So let's look at the aircraft surveys, which is one step below the satellites. So this has turned out to be a pretty powerful method. Again, you can do this a few times a year, sort of economically reasonable. This survey covered 55,000 square kilometers Permian Basin, 72,000 wells were visited. And each emission event is shown as a dot. They're quantified, and the range here being 2 kilograms an hour to more than 1,000. What's sort of scary about this is that these emission events were only detected at 1.5% of the well survey. So you are looking for a needle in a haystack. The needle is of highly variable size and it's intermittent. So it's like the world's worst measurement problem. So this is why people have been trying to figure out how to measure methane for a long time. And we're going to get to the satellite story in a minute, and that is going to be an advance over. Okay. Now there's another issue, which is where do these emissions take place? So as the slide says, carbon dioxide originates from beneficial production of heat and energy. Burn a fossil fuel, you get heat and energy for your trouble. You get carbon dioxide, which you don't want, but at least it has some use. It's not worthless. Methane is purely a waste product of the fossil fuel supply chain. So whereas carbon dioxide is proportional to fossil fuel consumption, which you know very well, and it always happens in your country, right? You're producing electricity in your own country, you're producing heat in your own country, industrial processes in your own country. So carbon dioxide can be regulated by individual nations. They don't have to cooperate. Methane? No. Methane comes mostly from the supply chain. Now, if you're in Europe, 90% of your natural gas and about 95% of your oil comes from exporters that are not in the European Union. And that's where all your methane leaks are coming from. So if you're charged or take responsibility for the methane in the upstream supply chain, you have no control over it because it's happening in some exporting nation. And believe me, a lot of those exporters are not particularly careful about how they manage their fossil fuel industries. So if you're looking for reports, for example, from the exporters, not all the reports are equally reliable. Okay, let me show you an example. Self-reported methane emissions from the Russian Federation. I did a treatise on this subject also. And basically, if you look at the methane intensity, which is the amount of methane that you are estimating going into the atmosphere divided by the energy use of your fossil fuel stream, that's what methane intensity is. Now, as you now all know, it's very difficult to estimate methane emissions. But in the United States, the EPA has been working on this very hard. I mean, they really do review their processes every year. They have 250 line items of places they look for methane emissions. So it's a really big deal, and they're very conscientious about it. And so over the period from 2013 to 2020, the estimated methane emissions have been going down steadily but slowly in kind of a measured way. Okay, let's look at Russia, Russian Federation, which is the red line. Their emissions decreased by 89% in 6 years. I studied their UNFCCC report, which they have to submit every year, very carefully. They're making stuff up. I mean, that's all I can say. I actually testified about this to Congress a year and a half ago, and one of the congressmen from Texas said, "This looks suspicious." Yeah. So I don't think anything. which just happen to exceed the United States in environmental, environmental compliance. So it just barely got under the US number. Thank you. They can stop now. Okay. So that's kind of the measurement thing. I spent a lot of time on it because I'm really interested in it. And measurement can be hard. That's kind of the bottom line lesson here. And estimates can be hard. Reporting's. So let's look at impact measurement. So what do we do with all this data? Okay. So if you want to now, the United States is the world's largest producer of natural gas. At this point, we are producing more gas than we can use. And so naturally, our gas producers are interested in developing new markets, which would be in other countries. However, the Natural Gas Act of 1938 says, quoting here, no person shall export any natural gas from the United States to a foreign country without first having secured an order of the Commission authorizing it to do so. And the Commission shall issue such order upon application unless it finds the proposed exportation will not be in the public interest. Sorry for the double negative, but you get the idea. In order to export gas to another country, you have to show it's consistent with public interest. Now, the commission they're talking about here is the Federal Power Commission, doesn't exist anymore. That power has been transferred to the Secretary of Energy. So up till now, the Secretary of Energy has given permits for anything that came along. The National Energy Technology Lab did a study of greenhouse gas emissions from liquefied natural gas, which is how it's being exported. NETL found that the emissions were lower than what the gas was presuming to displace in the foreign country, named coal, and so everything is good. Copacetic, we'll give you this. Great. However, on January 26th of this year, the Department of Energy announced it was updating its public interest analysis, that 5-year-old NETL report, and pausing permitting of facilities allowed to export LNG while the update is underway. Okay, well, you can imagine what happened. Oil and gas industry, sort of went ballistic. Interestingly, one of the prime areas for gas export is in Speaker Michael Johnson's congressional district, Painesville, in Louisiana. So he has Speaker of the House of Representatives, some personal interest in this question. Okay, so we're not gonna, that's politics, Rocco. Let's look at the report that the Department of Energy had been relying upon, and then this new report, which sort of injected some doubt into the question. Okay, so the report that had been relied upon was the National Energy Technology Laboratory, NETL, report from 2019. And so what they did was they calculated how much greenhouse gas was going to be emitted from a coal burning power plant in China and compared that to the greenhouse gas emitted in connection with producing natural gas in the United States, in Louisiana, actually, sending it to a liquefaction plant on the Gulf Coast of the US, shipping it by tanker halfway around the world to Shanghai, and then burning it in the Chinese power plant. So there's 3 colors here. And again, directing your attention to the left-hand half of this chart. There's a bar for coal, a bar for LNG. The black is the CO2 from the power plant in Shanghai. Either the coal burning plant or the gas burning plant, those numbers are handbook values, so no one's arguing about those. The green is the carbon dioxide emitted in the process of getting the gas out of the wells, liquefied into the tanker to Shanghai. So that's sort of the upstream overhead energy, if you will, of just getting a natural resource from the United States to China. Those numbers are pretty well understood because again, it's carbon dioxide, we've already discussed that. We know what the processes are, you just add them up and those numbers agree. The red bars are methane. Now, and we've already discussed how hard it is to measure methane or impossible to estimate it. Those numbers are very, very hard to estimate. So NETL, US government lab, did their level best and decided back in 2019 that the coal burning plant in Shanghai was emitting much more greenhouse gas than producing gas in the United States, processing it, liquefaction, the tanker and all that stuff. When all was said and done, much less greenhouse gas, that's the smaller bar. That's what the Department of Energy has been sitting on for the last 5 years, perfectly happy with that. Earlier this year, in January, Professor Robert Howarth from Cornell University came up with his assessment and his bars. And as you see, the results are very different. What he found was that if you want to minimize greenhouse gases from a Chinese electric power industry, you're better off burning coal than importing natural gas to the United States because there are these overheads, especially methane. A lot of methane is being emitted in the process of getting the gas from the US to China. Now, which one is right? I think I've convinced you that no one knows whether the small red bar is the right one or the big red bar is the right one. And by the way, we're doing what I said you shouldn't do, which is adding together methane and carbon dioxide on a common scale. Dead wrong. I just finished a 4,000 word critique of both of these reports, basically saying that neither of them are reliable for that reason, but we're just gonna look at what the Secretary of Energy is looking at. So Secretary of Energy looked at this and said, oh my God, we're gonna have to look at the public interest determination again. And that's why we're not giving any permits until we get this sorted out. Basically, what the NETL did was they computed the greenhouse gas output per megawatt hour of electric output at the output of a power plant. Howarth calculated the greenhouse gas emission per megajoule of thermal energy at the input of the power plant. That makes a big difference, and that's basically, so that's why the bars at the left don't even look like, I mean, don't compare at all with the bars on the right, they're actually two different things. And although both reports do point out, I mean, they say what they're doing, they don't really point out that these give different answers. NETL just did it using the electrical output. Howarth just did it using the thermal input with no further comment. And I think that was completely overlooked and missed. So at least I haven't heard any commentary about it. And I don't have an opinion about which is the right way. No, there is methane from coal mines. In fact, coal mines are the principal source of methane in China. And so Howarth, actually, I checked out his number because this is an important issue. I checked out his number. He actually used a number consistent with what the Chinese petroleum engineering community uses. NETL completely missed it. Yeah, so that's something where NETL screwed it up. So in the Howarth method, you're looking at the amount of greenhouse gas emitted per megajoule of thermal energy. Okay, and as we discussed earlier, that is basically chemistry. So you know exactly how much CO2 you're going to be emitting by burning a given amount of coal. The NETL uses the output in the denominator of the emission intensity. So that depends on what kind of plant you have. So I believe what was used here was US fleet average coal burning power plant and natural gas burning power plant. The coal burning plants are less efficient than the gas burning plants. So that lower efficiency amplifies the bar
Okay.
on the coal side relative to the gas side. That's why the proportions are different. Every choice any TL made in their parameters, their methods, whether they're going to use the input or the output energies, every one preferenced gas as giving a lower greenhouse gas emission intensity. Every parameter and method that Howarth used preferenced coal as using a lower greenhouse gas intensity. All I'm saying is it's a really interesting coincidence. And what I wrote in my report is that I believe both groups have used the parameters and methods that they honestly believed were the best ones. They just happen to be all in preference to gas on the NETL side. Let's call that free gas. And Howarth used every parameter that preferenced coal on his side. Okay, maybe. Howarth is a long-term activist sort of against power fossil fuels. He's been at this for at least 15 years. I'm not saying his parameters are wrong, and in many cases, I think his parameters are better and more believable than the NETL. But nonetheless, that's the way it's sort of figured out. Okay, that's back to politics. That's okay. Now let's look at the question of environmental scoring. So is it possible to come up with some realistic scheme for scoring of greenhouse gas environmental issues? And for carbon dioxide, no problem. Yes, absolutely. You all know that now. If you just look at electric power plants, as I said, there are 10 book values of the amount of carbon dioxide you can get. And again, this is the per megawatt hour scale. So they're different for different processes. So we have we have one coal line here, which is higher. There's two lines for natural gas because two different processes. One is the natural gas combustion turbine, which is the fast responding, turn it on for peak power. The other one is the natural gas combined cycle, which is the slower to start up. That's the one you use for base load. Base load one is more efficient in terms of less carbon dioxide per megawatt. But no problem with these numbers. There's no dispute at all. Okay, methane, hard to quantify. So people who have thought about this have, and I don't think this has ever been enunciated, it's clearly in people's minds. So either you have to catch them in the act by finding that needle in the haystack that only appears intermittently, or there's another method, which is sort of satellite based, which is monitoring atmospheric concentrations. Okay, let's have a look at those two choices for how to score fossil fuel emissions. Okay, here something has been caught in the act. This is an infrared picture, false colors on this, of a tank, a storage tank. It's an oil storage tank. And it has pressures built up. You do not want that tank to blow up. You do not want that tank to blow up. So you vent gas to keep the pressure down. That's the sort of pinkish, reddish, I guess, reddish plume that's coming out of this thing. So you could say, oh my God, we've got this emission. Now you don't know how long this emission persists. It might only be a few minutes. But anyway, you caught them in the act. You know that there's methane coming from this source, and this is not an unusual, unfortunately. This is not an unusual circumstance. It happens about 1.5% of the time, more or less. Here is the other method. This is the satellite-based method. So satellites are really good at measuring atmospheric concentration. They're not good at figuring out where the methane came from, but they're pretty good at determining how much methane has come out. And it's a pretty complicated method. I'm not going to go into the details of it. But on the left is a map, obviously, of the United States with methane concentrations and that have been assigned to the petroleum systems. The assignment is pretty complicated, but very smart people are working. Natural gas systems on the right. Again, this is where there's a lot of methane coming from, natural gas systems. These are not on equal footings, by the way. The petroleum system gas is only from just sort of well site production. Once it gets into any kind of pipe, it's counted in the natural gas system. So these are not directly comparable. But it is indicative of where there are problems. So on the left, you can see there's sort of a band kind of mid-continent running from North Dakota through Wyoming, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana. Those are places where oil and gas are produced together, by and large. And that is a danger point because as soon as oil mixed with gas gets into one of those tanks, then you've got the pressure problem that I just told you about, and lots of methane gets vented or flared or whatever. The natural gas systems is more distributed over all sources of gas in the country, and because that counts emissions from pipes and so on, that's sort of more distributed. So if there's no pipeline, there's no way of getting gas out except venting or flaring. And so you're going to be, now these wells are producing well, constantly, but not necessarily at a constant rate. And yeah, you can build more tanks, but that quickly becomes uneconomic. You need a way of sending it to market. Gas is like electricity. It's got to move along. Yeah. And so the right thing to do is to build a pipeline to market. Sometimes that is not practical either for economic reasons or because the market is too far away. So yeah, then you have to flare or no. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a draconian penalty on emitting methane, $1,500 a ton. That is draconian, far above the market price. So that is going to encourage people to build pipelines when it would otherwise be economic, including the Mountain Valley Pipeline, actually, which was Senator Manchin's very favorite pipeline. So yeah. Okay. So, okay, realistic scoring of greenhouse gas environmental issues, methane, hard to quantify, but not impossible. So we saw that satellite result. So then you sort of ask, so if you're going to environmentally score something, what can you score? Well, can you score each site? You got 1 million wells, can you score each one individually and sell them at different prices? No, far too many, right? There's 1 million of them. Company level, okay, that's more, okay, there are 9,000 oil and gas producers in the United States, but let's say only 100 of them are worth tracking. But the problem is that each of those companies has tens of thousands of sites, and getting surveys that are statistically significant is an unsolved problem. National level, yeah, if you have a small country, that's okay. But if you have the United States or Russia, both of which have enormous industries, I mean, the United States produces today, what's the number? Yeah, it produces 100 billion cubic feet a day. So national level is too big. Basin level is interesting. So I put best bet The reason it's interesting is that the characteristics of oil wells are really more basin dependent than anything else. So by basin, I mean a large area where the geology is more or less uniform, right? So the Central Valley of California, San Joaquin Basin, one geology. Marcellus in Pennsylvania, one geology, although there's some gradients. So inside of 1 week, I was talking to somebody who's very well placed in the European Commission, who's writing these rules for Europe, and he said, we're thinking about basin level these days. Later that week, I was talking to one of the chief principal people in charge of methane sat, which is the Environmental Defense Fund, home built and home financed satellites to detect methane. And I asked him, well, what exactly, how did you launch it? What exactly are you going to do with it? He said, we're going to focus on basin level. Now, that may not be a coincidence because we know that the Environmental Defense Fund and the European Commission talk very frequently. So basin seems to be where people are going. It matches up with the spatial resolution of satellites. So I think that's really where we're going to be quantifying methane at that level, which is the thousands of square kilometers. Okay. So in fact, here are some basin level places where we know there are problems, and those are the ones that have a lot of methane gas coming from petroleum. These are basins that are known to be problem basins. So these are in your risk-based approach. This is where it's making. Okay, so yeah, the next part is trade policy. Let's save that for another time, because that is pretty complicated, and yeah, we'll run. Oh, it's very interesting. Let's go to satellites. So this is now in sort of European circles, certainly, and more here, it's sort of looking like the best way to go. And in fact, the European Union just passed a law on methane emissions in which they said, this is a direct quote from the law, the Commission, that is the European Commission, shall establish a global methane monitoring tool based on satellite data. So good things about satellites: provide global semi-continuous surveillance of methane emissions without requiring permission of the oil and gas exporting nations. That is super important because if you want to fly aircraft, you need to get a permit in every nation except, as far as I know, except the United States and Canada, where all you need is to file a flight. Other countries, you're not going to be able to fly over Russia's infrastructures. So satellites provide global semi-continuous surveillance of methane emissions without requiring permission. Right? There are some problems with satellites. They do not provide equally reliable data across all geographies. So you need the right solar illumination. You need the right terrain. Trees are bad, water is very bad, snow is bad. The color of the ground makes a difference. Turns out brown is a good color. That's kind of fortunate. And then, of course, you've got a variety of methane sources. So if you've got a lot of herds of cattle mixed in with your oil production, which is certainly true in the United States, separating them is a problem. So basically, favorable geographies are the Middle East and North Africa, which are good gas producing areas. Unfavorable, definitely Russia. But I think the Europeans have been pretty clever here. Probably this is all that realistically can be done. Okay, last slide, investment allocation. So I'm just going to read this. Something very strange happened in US EPA rulemaking. A buy-side investment house, PIMCO, submitted a comment on a regulation. I can tell you this is extremely unusual. I mean, I've done a study of comments submitted to EPA. I've never seen this before. What PIMCO told the EPA was, quote, Clear, ambitious methane regulations can assist investors such as PIMCO to better execute a more effective transition risk mitigation strategy, as a predictable regulatory landscape is likely to lead to increasingly dependable CapEx guidance and improved data transparency. So this is sort of where we connect our impact measurement and our allocation. So we should get them going, kind of. Anyway, that's takes care of it. It was being testified to Congress. Please get in touch with me if you want to hear more about this